While Resident Evil may have moved past the classic survival horror vibe that the franchise was built upon, that doesn't necessarily mean old school survival horror is completely dead. In fact, for fans that grew up playing those original RE games, complete with fixed camera angles and retro graphics, there's a whole indie survival horror genre dedicated to giving us love letters to those games. Actually, in the month of October alone, we received not one, but 3 incredible indie survival horror games that are heavily inspired by old school Resident Evil. So, on this episode of Nerdspace Games, I want to pay homage to the games that released in the last 5 or so years that were the perfect love letters to the old school survival horror genre that made me fall in love with video games all of those years ago. In terms of the games that qualify for this list, I'm looking at everything that was involved with that original Resident Evil trilogy. Fixed camera angles, limited resources, inventory management, tank controls, difficult puzzles, save rooms complete with memorable save room music, unique and terrifying monster designs, with zombies specifically being a major bonus, and an eerie location, usually a creepy mansion or small town being the main setting of the game. I also want to note that I'll be featuring top-down old school survival horror games in a separate list later this year because, quite honestly, there's just so many of those type of games, but I view them as a slightly different genre than the games that I'm going to be talking about today. So games like Signalis and Darkwood, while incredible old school survival horror games, will appear in that list instead, but basically, I'm just saying don't crucify me when you don't see those games on today's list. Before we get started though, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel for more survival horror content. Also hit that like button if you enjoyed today's topic. Anyway, my name is Ruben with Nerdspace Games, and here are my top 10 best classic Resident Evil clones of the last 5 years. Let's get it. Number 10, Post Trauma. Post Trauma is a game that, quite honestly, I almost didn't include on this list. Actually, there's multiple reasons for that. For one, the game features multiple different perspectives at different points of the story, including first person. And 2, it felt more like a puzzle game than your traditional survival horror game. Not to mention, it actually took more inspiration from Silent Hill than it did classic Resident Evil. Still, despite the flaws and departures that it had from classic survival horror, Post Trauma is still a game that mostly captures the same feelings and vibes we got when playing old school Resident Evil. You'll have terrifying enemy designs, limited resources, inventory management, and of course, limited saves. And as someone that appreciates extremely difficult puzzles in my survival horror games, I really enjoyed the amount of difficult ones that we got in Post Trauma, even if it felt like it overshadowed the combat of the game. You also got to explore a lot of different locations, despite the game appearing to take place mostly inside of a subway station based on the trailers that we saw. I don't think the story or the dialogue is really anything to write home about, but I don't think we actually play these classic survival horror games for the stories. I mean, let's be real here, guys. We play them because we love the nostalgic gameplay mechanics that remind us of the games that some of us grew up with. I don't think Post Trauma is the perfect love letter to classic Resident Evil, but I do think it deserves enough to at least be mentioned as one of the games that scratches that same itch as classic Resident Evil does for us. Especially if your favorite parts about those games were the puzzles, the soundtrack, and the atmosphere, as that's something that Post Trauma nails perfectly. Number 9, Hollowbody. Speaking of survival horror games that probably appeals more to Silent Hill fans than Resident Evil, Hollowbody is another indie survival horror game released in the last year that was heavily inspired by the classics. This game takes place inside of a ruined city full of monsters, and the exploration kind of reminds me of the Silent Hill series. You're able to travel to different parts of the town and even explore inside certain buildings that are not required for completing the game, which is actually something that I low-key love in my old school survival horror games. Doing this allows you to find additional resources and, more importantly, new ways to end the game, as Hollowbody features multiple endings. In terms of the gameplay, Hollowbody combines different elements of old school survival horror. Most of the time you use a camera angle that's kind of similar to the Silent Hill games, in which the camera follows behind you and you're able to move it around a bit to see from different perspectives. However, you'll also have certain rooms and areas in the game that kind of go back to your traditional fixed camera angles like the original Resident Evil trilogy. In terms of the combat, it's what you would expect from a love letter to classic survival horror with slight changes. But aesthetics wise, the game takes place in a distant future, which kind of adds a cyberpunk-like vibe to the game, allowing it to feel somewhat different from other indie survival horror games. The only real reason why I don't have Hollowbody higher on today's list is due to it missing some of the key components of classic survival horror that the Resident Evil trilogy had. For example, there's a severe lack of puzzles, the atmosphere and soundtrack doesn't hit the same highs as other games on this list, and because it felt more like a love letter to classic Silent Hill versus old school Resident Evil, I felt it was better to keep it lower on today's list. With all of that being said though, Hollowbody is a great play for anybody that's a fan of both old school Resident Evil and Silent Hill. Just manage your expectations, as the game isn't extremely long, and as with the opposite of Post Trauma actually, it doesn't feature any good puzzles really. Number 8, The Mew House. There's a lot of indie survival horror games that are being talked about right now that you'll see pop up on today's list. However, one game that I didn't hear talked about as much, perhaps because it released in the month of January of this year, is The Mew House. I really don't understand why this game isn't on people's radar, as it is quite honestly one of the best love letters to classic Resident Evil specifically I've ever played. For one, the setting is really identical to the Spencer Mansion, as you'll find yourself exploring a giant mansion and a guest house, which ultimately features a lot, and I mean a lot of backtracking. But here's the thing, if you're like me and you grew up with that original Resident Evil game, then you already know that backtracking kind of comes with the territory when playing a classic survival horror game. Anyways, seeing the different camera angles of Mew House really brings me back to my days of playing through the Spencer Mansion for the first time, and man, this game was extremely nostalgic for me, but also kind of different. While you have inventory management and limited resources just like other classic survival horror games, the Mew House also used a similar combat mechanic as Crow Country, in which you could use the red laser to point your gun at weak spots on the enemies and take them out faster, conserving valuable resources. Reloading was something that took some time getting used to, as you would need to reload magazines, swap them out, and then pick them up again when your character dropped an empty magazine while reloading. Honestly, I don't actually love that specific mechanic, and I never have when it was featured in other survival horror games I've played, but it does add something that makes this game feel a little different from other classic survival horror games. All in all, the Mew House is arguably the most underrated indie survival horror game on this list, and I wouldn't be surprised if this is the one game on this list that some of you guys have never heard of. But if you're a fan of challenging puzzles, a nostalgic looking mansion, and fixed camera angles, then there's really no reason why you won't love this game. Well, unless you're definitely afraid of giant spiders, because yeah, there's a creepy crawler boss fight midway through this game, so be warned. Number 7, Heartworm. Heartworm not only takes inspiration from old school Resident Evil and Silent Hill, but it also takes heavy inspiration from the Fatal Frame series. As with every other game on today's list, Heartworm features just about everything you would expect from an old school survival horror game. Limited resources, inventory management, iconic save rooms complete with that catchy theme, and of course, fixed camera angles. Although on the topic of fixed camera angles, Heartworm also allows you to play it in third person over the shoulder perspectives if you prefer it that way, as well as play without the retro aesthetics that are inspired by PlayStation 1 games. But I definitely recommend it with the retro graphics and the fixed camera angles. The inspiration that it takes from the Fatal Frame series that I mentioned earlier comes in the form of combat, as the game changes up the formula by giving you a camera and film to fight off enemies in place of gun and bullets. Actually, on that note, while I normally recommend fixed camera angles if given the option in a lot of the survival horror games out there, Heartworm is kind of the one exception to that rule. See, as I stated earlier, I recommend playing the game with fixed camera angles and retro graphics, but you can also just change up the perspectives of the combat alone. And since the game takes some inspiration from Fatal Frame, it's honestly kind of nice to just use the over-the-shoulder perspective for the combat of the game. That way it feels more like Fatal Frame combat. Doing this will give you Fatal Frame combat, Resident Evil in terms of the gameplay mechanics, and Silent Hill in terms of the atmosphere. So perfect mixture of 3 of the best horror franchises out there. Number 6, Crow Country. Crow Country was easily one of the best indie survival horror games of 2024, and to this day, it's a game that I revisit at least every other month. The main reason why is because everything about Crow Country screams nostalgia for fans of old school Resident Evil, but it also does it in a way that has some sort of unique charm of its own. While the game isn't exactly fixed camera angles, as the player is able to move the camera angle around the room to get the best view possible, it does still share a lot of the same similarities as old school Resident Evil. The main enemies of the game are zombies and other monsters created from some sort of virus from an alternate dimension. Inventory management and limited resources are key here, and the player will need to use these resources wisely, as there's a lot more monsters in this theme park than the amount of bullets given to you. Oh, and on that note, the setting of an abandoned theme park full of zombies and monsters around every corner just screams the perfect setting for a survival horror game. You of course have your save rooms complete with one of the best themes in all indie survival horror games. And one bonus when it comes to the combat of the game is the fact that you're able to control where you aim, even if it's a bit clunky and takes some time getting used to. I've said this in my review of the game when it first released, but the retro PS1 graphics has a unique charm that is unmatched by any other indie survival horror game, as it takes the polygon aesthetic seen in Final Fantasy VII and applies it to a survival horror game. I do like the puzzles, but I kind of wish they were a bit more challenging, and the combat side of things, while clunky, gives off traditional old school survival horror vibes. Regardless, fans of classic survival horror will absolutely love this game, with the amount of nostalgia waiting for them in Crow Country, from the inventory screen to the sound design of the game itself, both reminding us of aspects that we loved about the original Resident Evil trilogy. Number 5, Flesh Made Fear. Flesh Made Fear is the indie survival horror game that's most fresh on my mind right now, as I just beat it maybe a few days before recording this video, but man, did it hit all the right places when it came to my love for old school Resident Evil. This game is not afraid to wear its inspiration on its sleeves, as not only does it feature a lot of the same mechanics as old school Resident Evil, but it also gives us a ton of Easter eggs in that original trilogy, complete with collectible plushies of our favorite horror content creators. Sadly, your boy's not one of them, but hey, maybe Flesh Made Fear 2, possibly, who knows? Guys, hit me up. I want that plushie. Anyway, gameplay wise, it has everything you'd expect from a love letter to classic Resident Evil. An elite squad is sent to a mostly abandoned city full of zombies to investigate the causes and eliminate the man responsible for it. You even get 2 campaigns with slight differences to the story and the characters you interact with, while also getting unique areas to explore with each character. Combat is traditional Resident Evil mechanics with a twist. You still have X camera angles, inventory management complete with a status screen that somehow feels familiar if you know what I mean, and plenty of puzzles to solve. However, unlike old school Resident Evil, you have a slight focus on melee thanks to your pair of combat knives. While I personally didn't use them very often against normal enemies in the game, they were actually pretty useful against bosses of the game because, well, most of them would end up stunned for a bit after shooting them a little bit, leaving them open for some stabs, which of course deals major damage without wasting precious resources. Number 4, Alisa. I'm probably much higher on Alisa than a lot of people, considering that this game isn't really talked about nearly as much as other classic indie survival horror games of the last decade, like Crow Country or Signalis. Still, if you're a fan of old school Resident Evil, then there really isn't a reason why you wouldn't fall in love with this game immediately upon playing it for the first time. In fact, Alisa is basically Resident Evil 1 combined with the world of Alice in Wonderland, in which traditional zombies are replaced with creepy ass puppets. It's probably getting a bit repetitive to hear this by now, but with Alisa, you can expect limited resources, inventory management, and extremely difficult puzzles. Actually, side note, when I played this game for the first time years ago, there were a few broken puzzles, but most of them have been patched since then, so no worries there, I think. You also have a heavy focus on melee as well, but honestly, it's a bit clunky, and I've always relied on my guns, or if my resources were low, I ran like hell. On the note of resources, and this could be viewed as a negative or positive depending on your preferences, but the game features a shop in which you can buy more resources with coins, which kind of ruins the whole limited resources part of the game, but whatever. However, said coins are also what is needed to save your game, so you just need to use those coins wisely or you won't be able to save the game. The last thing that I'll say is that the boss fights of the game are extremely challenging, at least for me they were. In fact, I would argue that Alisa might very well be one of, if not the hardest game on today's list, so if you like a challenge in your old school survival horror games, then Alisa is definitely for you. Though I'll have to admit, mostly the reason why I had so much difficulty fighting these bosses was just the clunky gameplay mechanics of Alisa, so I don't know if that's really a good thing to mention, but I figure I'd throw that out there. Number 3, Tormented Souls. Up until recently, Tormented Souls was my favorite indie survival horror game of all time. Not only was it a love letter to classic Resident Evil and Silent Hill, but it also moved away from the nostalgic PS1 graphics that a lot of indie survival horror games did when trying to replicate the formula, and gave us a game with classic controls, but with modern graphics. In that way, Tormented Souls, like the other 2 games in the top 3 that we'll talk about in just a moment, gave us something that was more similar to the 2002 remake of Resident Evil. While Burger Hospital, the main setting of Tormented Souls, would serve as the perfect love letter to the Spencer Mansion from the original game. And while Tormented Souls moved away from inventory management and you didn't have to worry about storing items in inventory boxes, you still had limited resources and terrifying monster designs to give us the same feels that Resident Evil Remake gave us. Sure, the dialogue was pretty brutal and the game lacked any interesting boss fights, but for Dual Effect's first attempt at the classic survival horror genre, I'd say they knocked it out of the park. Even the puzzles of the game were arguably some of the most difficult puzzles in any survival horror game, and far surpasses most of the Resident Evil games in that department. In fact, some of the puzzles were so unique as it required you to use time travel and alternate realities to solve solutions in the present or in the normal reality. It was a fantastic game that was almost perfect and only lacked a few things that, well, were kind of improved on in the future, but more on that later. Number 2, Echoes of the Living. Now, normally I don't include games that are still in early access for my list, but there was no way I was going to make this list without featuring one of the best recent examples of old school survival horror games complete with modern graphics. At the time of recording this video, only Liam's campaign is available for Echoes of the Living, which means the game is still only halfway complete, and there are still a few bugs that the development team of 2 people are still working on. So if you're someone that wants to hold off on buying this game until its final release, I don't blame you one bit. However, I at least want to put this on your radar because despite the bugs they are working on and the fact that the game is only halfway complete, Echoes of the Living is a near perfect love letter to fans of classic Resident Evil. In fact, Echoes of the Living is pretty much Resident Evil Remake but with elements of Resident Evil 2 OG. Yeah, like RE1 Remake, Echoes of the Living features fixed camera angles, limited resources, puzzles, inventory management, and everything you would expect from a classic survival horror game, but it does so with modern graphics. Then, instead of being set inside of a single location, like the Spencer Mansion, it puts you inside of a city full of multiple locations and 2 campaigns, each featuring their own puzzles, characters, and story. Yeah, clearly that part takes inspiration from Resident Evil 2. The game feels almost identical to Resident Evil Remake in terms of the gameplay, except that it also features a lot of melee weapons as well as other secondary weapons to slow down hordes of zombies attacking you. I think the thing that I love most about Echoes of the Living is the amount of different locations it has, with each feeling completely different from each other. In just Liam's campaign, you get to explore a sheriff station, city streets and alleyways, a hotel, a pub, and much more. You get a handful of puzzles that are on par with most Resident Evil games, and as a bonus, some of my favorite people voice characters in this game, including Kai, aka Ink Ribbon, and Tony from Residents of Evil. I absolutely love this game, and honestly speaking, it would be my favorite indie survival horror game of the year if it wasn't for one other game completely blowing me away a few weeks before this game came out. Side note though, this game could actually still claim the #1 spot once the second campaign releases and they patch the game to where they add in limited saves once you enter Alba City, because currently they use an autosave method from this point on because of a bug. But hopefully that'll be fixed soon because this game will be a masterpiece once it's complete and free of bugs. Number 1, Tormented Souls 2. At the time of recording this video, Tormented Souls 2 is my favorite survival horror game of the year, and it's my favorite indie survival horror game of all time. Everything I said about the original game that released about 4 years prior applies to this game, but it also fixes all the complaints I had with that original game, which wasn't a very long list to begin with. Like the original game, you still have fixed camera angles, a memorable soundtrack, very limited resources, and even more difficult puzzles scattered across the game, plus an iconic setting and terrifying enemy designs. Yeah, these were all things that were featured in the original game, but Tormented Souls 2 improved on these things. Then, as I said earlier, Tormented Souls 2 took the few issues I had about the original game and fixed them. For example, this time around, you had multiple boss fights that each pose a different challenge instead of a single boss fight in the original game. Sure, they were not extremely difficult to beat, but then again, bosses in classic survival horror games rarely are. On the note of the setting, Tormented Souls 2 was a much bigger game than the original in both the location and the completion time. Because the second game takes place inside of a small town, you get to explore multiple different locations, including a church, a processing plant, a mall, and a school. Each of these locations feel vastly different from each other, and there's a lot more reasons to explore and backtrack in this game, as you'll find new key items that'll open new areas featuring unique weapons and more key items needed to get a different ending in the game. And yeah, because there's more locations in this game, Tormented Souls 2 is about twice as long as the original game was, as it took me roughly 12 hours to beat in my first playthrough of the game. For the record, the first game took me about 4 to 5 hours in my first playthrough. And for those of you that played the original game and love the time travel mechanics and the alternate dimensions mechanic in the first game and the way it was used to solve certain puzzles, those same features are present in the sequel as well. Anyways, Tormented Souls 2 was the perfect love letter to classic Resident Evil and Silent Hill, and if you're a fan of those classics, I can't think of a better indie survival horror game that honors the games that I grew up with better than Tormented Souls 2. But that does it for this episode of Nerdspace Games. Hit up the comments and let me know what you think of my list. Is Tormented Souls 2 the best Resident Evil clone of the last decade, or is there a different indie survival horror game that deserves that title? Let me know your thoughts down below. Anyway, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel for more survival horror content. Also leave a like on today's video if you enjoyed today's topic. But thanks for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Nerdspace Games. Take care.